And now, the story of a show that came out too early to achieve the success it deserved. Right? That is how the line goes. The conventional wisdom is that Arrested Development was ahead of the curve. If you haven't seen it, first, what are you doing? But the elevator pitch is this. The show follows the downfall of the Bluth family, a formerly wealthy real estate dynasty after patriarch George Sr. is arrested for fraud, embezzlement, and a couple other things.
I may have committed some, light treason.
20 years on, it's a definitive cult classic. It regularly finds its way onto best ever sitcom lists, innumerable moments have become iconic.
No, I'm afraid I just blew myself.
There's gotta be a better way to say that.
And most of the core cast have gone on to become pretty darn famous. It's a good sitcom, sure, but it's also more than that. Take its density. The jokes are funny, but then they're funny again and again. Gags reoccur across episodes, across seasons even, sometimes obviously.
You're a chicken.
Cuckoo-ca-cha! Cuckoo-ca-cha!
Look, I haven't found the right girl. When I do, I will ask.
Sometimes less so.
George Michael's getting a little too old to hang out with his dad.
Yeah, and I'm getting too old for my mom to be with me.
The result is, well, I'll just quote Skip Intro, who has a whole video digging into the many layers of Arrested Development's callback humor.
Every joke builds on the previous one, carrying momentum from one moment to the next, before bringing all of its moving parts together for a big payoff. But how does Arrested do it? How does it wring comedy out of every last second of its 21-minute runtime? The answer is by creating its own language of running gags, character types, double meanings, and much, much more.
The layering here, the way you can pause, rewind, rewatch, and spot new things time and time again, might seem straightforwardly brilliant to the viewer watching in the streaming age, but Arrested Development aired 20 years ago. Why is that important? Well, again, another creator's already covered this. Let me turn you over to Drew Gooden briefly. Don't worry, this will be the last video citation.
You see, Arrested Development was always praised for its cleverness and originality during a time when simplistic, formulaic sitcoms were being birthed left and right. Each episode weaved together storylines and long-running bits in such a carefully crafted way that just wasn't typically seen on television. In fact, the show was so jam-packed with jokes that I think it was actually ahead of its time in a bad way.
Drew goes on to explain that while the show's layering fits perfectly with the sort of pause, rewind, rewatch tools and the viewing mentality we can take for granted today, that wasn't how people watched TV when the show first aired.
Arrested Development sets a standard for how a show can be written, but you have to zoom out and look at the entire picture as a whole before you can fully appreciate it, an option only available in hindsight and not to the viewers who at the time were only able to watch one episode a week.
The trouble here is obvious then. Arrested Development's strengths simply weren't accessible to the television audience of 2003. Sure, the DVR had been invented a few years earlier, but it wasn't yet widespread enough to change this. Even in 2009, 3 years after the show's initial run wrapped up, only a third of US households were using DVRs. But it's not just that, not simply that the character of the show seemed tailor-made for a way of watching TV that hadn't yet become the norm. The show's subject matter too seems curiously prescient. The backdrop for Michael, Job, and everyone else's white-collar oopsies is, of course, the embattled Bluth company, whose whole thing is vomiting out superfluous, shoddily built housing developments, a business model whose underlying instabilities would go on to trigger an economic sinkhole of sorts just a year or so after the show's initial run ended. One could also look to the show's format. Arrested Development was an early example of the mockumentary over studio audience shooting style that would blow up not long after. Would take the network sitcom world by storm, with The Office, Parks and Rec, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Modern Family, and plenty more taking cues from this aesthetic to greater or lesser degrees. Arrested Development reshaped sitcoms. Arrested Development was ahead of its time, was ahead of the curve. That's what everyone says. It's what everyone said, even then. Ratings were pretty dire, the show always struggled with getting people to watch it, but those who did loved it. It was a critical darling, and Alison Powell, writing for The Guardian, correctly predicted it would usher in a new age of comedy. So Arrested Development was ahead of the curve. Topically, critically, mechanically, sometimes to its own detriment. That is perhaps the defining aspect of its cult classic identity today. The idea that in the age of Netflix, in the age of DVRs even, 5, 10, now 20 years after the show first ran, we're in a better place to watch it on its own terms, to tune into what made this show so good. But is this the right way to understand Arrested Development today? Well, sure, but only to a point. Real quick, let's forget about Arrested Development. What new or newish TV have you watched recently? Succession? Only Murders in the Building? Beef? If you threw them on a USB stick and hopped in a time machine to 2043, presuming they still have USB ports, how are those going to be understood by the viewer of 20 years' time? How would Succession read if you didn't know who Rupert Murdoch was? How much of the fun in Only Murders relies on the cultural standing of its stars and the particular role podcasting played in late 2010s culture? Say we've got our shit together infrastructure-wise, and the current car-centric culture is a thing of the past. What does Danny's road rage signify now? What of Beef's atmosphere of crushing mundanity disappears? I don't know how any of these examples would scan to the 40s viewer. I don't know how any modern TV would, but I do know it would be different. I do know some things, some references, some layers of meaning would be lost, the same way that even the world's leading early modern historian with the world's greatest thesaurus wouldn't be able to get everything out of Hamlet. So even if, in some respects, Arrested Development was ahead of its time, in a far more important way, it was also of its time, and by this I mean two things. First, that even those steps Mitch Hurwitz and co took to push the genre forward with Arrested Development that seem more in line with the industry of the 2010s were responses, considered ones, not random, to the industry conditions of 2003.
In my mind, I felt like there was maybe a new kind of lower cost sort of television that could be produced that would utilize a new kind of visual vocabulary that was coming out of reality television and docu-TV, sort of like Cops.
The same's also true for the thematic prescience, that it's not some big coincidence that this show skewered pre-2008 real estate practices just before a paradigm shift, simply that things which seem dumb in retrospect do also seem dumb beforehand if you're paying attention. And second, that a lot of the show's wit, sharpness, and satirical punch at time of release came from its direct and fairly bold responsiveness to early 2000s US and world politics, particularly the Iraq War. Consider the following examples.
I'm supposed to write 200 words on the morality of war, whether a preemptive strike is ever justified.
Absolutely, it's preemptive. It happens before something else. So if you can predict aggression and you want to squash it, I don't know why you're not typing. This is all good.
No blood, no oil. There's no I in win.
And he'll say,
patient presented with gastric bacterial infection.
wow. My brother wasn't up.
I thought that was the guy who played the soup Nazi.
We've been looking for WMDs for years. WMDs? This thing is as fake as Ahmed's mustache.
The thing is, for some of you, the younger viewers, those examples won't have fulfilled their intended purpose, because you didn't recognize exactly what those clips are responding to. True, today it's still easy enough to recognize that building homes for Saddam Hussein behind the US government's back was probably a no-no, but beyond this, things get murky fast. See, I think one part of what Arrested Development was trying to do is a kind of glass onion type thing. The Bluths were a type and a class of people that, especially back then, were seen as competent and good, and the show is awfully clear that no, they're not. Part of what the Iraq stuff conveys is that the same might be true higher up the chain. But that doesn't really come through in the way it might have 20 years back if you don't spot the Bluth-Rumsfeld parallel, or if you can't recall the particular flavor of war on terror, hyperbolic nationalism. Today's viewers, even the ones born pre-2K, probably can't. And Zoomers, forget about it. So maybe Arrested Development was made to be binged, to be pored over, frozen, rewound, made to be watched in a way that most of its initial viewership didn't yet watch. But it was also made to be watched in the mid-2000s. So today, Sure, the mechanical, formal aspects sparkle more, the gags, the layers, the language of callback, but the satire all that's in service of is dulled. Maybe we do experience Arrested Development better than those initial viewers did on the show's first airing, but we also experience it worse. Arrested Development wasn't ahead of the curve, or on the curve, or behind it, not really, because the curve doesn't exist. It's a figure of speech. Forget the curve. Today, Arrested Development is an artifact from a fading past, whose textual recesses we're maybe able to better access. Thing is, we have lost a fair amount of what those recesses were always signifying. But that's not quite the end of the story, is it? How could it be? If so much of Arrested Development's heft was tied into its timeliness, why do new viewers still latch onto it? Why is the show's critical reputation still intact? Well, yes, the show took many of its cues from the business and politics of its day, and the way those spheres were perceived and represented in popular culture and everyday life during the Bush years. But while many individual moments in the show are responding to specific news items or cultural points, taken as a whole, all these specific, you-had-to-be-there points sort of melt together, become trends. And looking at these, together with the show's broader satirizing of things which have remained more constant, the often illogical logic of business, or the moral hypocrisy and out-of-touchness of one-percenters,
I mean, it's one banana, Michael. What could it cost? $10?
something becomes clear. Yes, Arrested Development mocks specific political and cultural points, drew a fair amount of its identity and its critical success from its timeliness, but at heart, its satire isn't simply referential. It understands patterns. And because there's always another bullshit war, always another nepo baby business freak screwing over the people actually creating their company's value, always more aesthetic appropriation of progressivism by neolibs, relevance, meaning can always emerge. So sure, in 2023, we have lost a fair amount of what Arrested Development's textual recesses were trying to signify, but that isn't to say that the show's commentary doesn't say anything to newer viewers, it just says other stuff. That stuff might not have been directly intended, but unintentional meaning is still meaning, and is still meaningful. Arrested Development's real strength isn't the binge-predicting layeredness of its humor, and it isn't the show's direct satire. It's the way the two intersect, the layeredness of meaning that follows, the polysemic capacity the show has as a result to keep generating new readings, and keep attaching itself to an ever-changing world. That's more interesting to me than the ahead-of-its-time identity Arrested Development is sometimes reduced to in discussion today. And I hope my discussion of all this has been interesting to you too. If so, you've got my supporters on Patreon to thank. This video was the result of November's community video poll. Every other month, my patrons get to pick a video topic for me to make, and if you think that sounds like a fun idea, check out the link down below and consider signing up yourself. Huge shout out to all my present supporters on screen now, especially Hanan, Daniel Goldhorn, Karen Kuhlman, Magath, Ryan Emily, Something Capitalism Bad, Thomas R, and Weirdy Beardy. It makes a huge difference, and don't forget to throw your thoughts down below. Maybe a like too if you're feeling generous.